couple of days ago, I visited with my friend Craig Hill about status, ambition, and ministry. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Oh, wow. Look at
Yeah,
that.
you don't want to see my home office.
That's cool. I got to turn your volume up here on my computer so I can hear you a bit better.
Well, the one problem with this setup is I have a window to the side of me, so it's a bit bright on that side of my face. But with this virtual background, your hair keeps changing.
I was going to say, if you move quick one way or the other, you lose a little bit.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Well, I have loads of them, but that's the one. Since I figured I'd use Perkins for the background here, but just for a second, I will give you another. There's one.
Oh, there you go. I like that.
There's Oxford. We have some new paintings at Perkins. That's one with the foot washing. It's just really beautiful.
That's appropriate. Yeah.
I got a million of them. I was actually in February. That's the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone with the Lower Falls there in the background. We were there in February for a few days, which was fabulous.
Wow,
that's the inside of Perkins Chapel.
Oh yeah.
There, yeah. Figured, and then if we had something to celebrate.
Right, that's the day they find a cure for the virus.
That's right. Yeah, we'll put that up.
Yeah, no, that's cool because my wife, when I said, okay, I'm going to start doing these interviews, these visits with folks and record them, she said, okay, well, you got to be aware of your surroundings, make sure everything looks okay behind you, and so right before I started this Zoom, I had her in here, and she stood over here to the side. She said, "Yeah, that all looks okay. Make sure that there's no, dirty socks in the background, all that kind of thing." So I'm gonna have to look into.
Yeah, this is a lot easier than cleaning.
Anyway, you know what, Craig? I in the midst of all of this stuff, and most of us preachers are out there putting our stuff online, and we're gauging how well we're doing by likes and shares and all that kind of stuff. We've got more people. I don't know if this kind of creates more of an ambitious environment for preachers, because I've been guilty of it. I looked today to see how many people watched our Maundy Thursday devotion, and I got to admit, it's probably a lot more than would have actually shown up in the sanctuary.
Yeah, I've heard that from a number of people. Yeah.
But I thought it'd be interesting to talk about, because we're kind of now really thrust into this age of likes and shares and almost pushing us towards this whole ambition. And you wrote a book on this tension between being a servant and being ambitious and all of that. I don't know. I thought it would be kind of an interesting angle, especially at the time that we're living in.
Yeah. Well, it's a perennial problem or issue, at least, and it's not. One of the things I tried to do in the book was to be brutally honest, about myself as well as other people's motives, and to admit that, inevitably our motives are going to be mixed. I mean, we're humans. We don't ever entirely understand ourselves, and even people with a significant amount of self-knowledge, they're still something of a mystery of themselves. I wouldn't expect anyone. I mean, if you wait until you have utterly unmixed, pure motives, you'll probably never do anything, because you're not likely you will, or you'll be fooling yourself.
Right.
But to go into something and try to be as honest and straightforward with yourself as possible, and be willing to to surround yourself to some extent with at least a handful of people who can be very honest with you about yourself and what you're doing. I think I'm getting way ahead of myself here, but one of the most valuable things you can really learn to do is not to take yourself too seriously and be able to laugh at yourself. I still do things, and I'll stop and go, "What on earth are you, why did you, there you go again."
Right.
One of the temptations for me, I mentioned this in the book, is just to name drop, for instance, that
Mm-hmm.
and that's that's a perfect example of how something can be mixed, because there can be perfectly legitimate reasons for mentioning someone's name. Something comes up in a conversation, and you'll say, well, when I was speaking with so and so last year or whatever, and well, if so and so happens to be impressive, you know, maybe, did you have to mention that? Did you? I don't know. Uh, I mean, you can be stymied by being so careful about that. But I think there are a lot of very important lessons to be learned on this, and um, one of them has to do with just I am at my best inevitably when I'm at my most self-forgetful. When this is true, I think, across the spectrum of people. When you've given yourself to something much larger than yourself, and this is, of course, very true right now,
Mm-hmm.
with COVID-19 and just all the heroic things so many people are doing. They're not thinking about themselves, or at least it's kind of something they're setting aside, and you're giving yourself to concerns much bigger than yourself. I mean, that's actually when you tend to be happiest. That's certainly when you tend to be most fulfilled.
Right.
The times when you're most focused on yourself tend to be times, when actually you aren't happy, you aren't fulfilled. Everybody I've known, well, I'm going to make a wild generalization. Stop myself. Most of the people I've known who seem to be chronically unhappy, what they have in common is they're scorekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
They're constantly keeping score of how many slights have they endured. I mean, they're grudge holders, they're scorekeepers. The people I know who are the most extraordinary people, the most attractive people, in a sort of ironic way, are the people who are able to be self-forgetful and be able to give themselves to something much larger. And of course, this is exactly what Jesus taught.
Mm-hmm.
No surprise. It's in service, that we find ourselves. It's in giving ourselves that we find ourselves, that we receive. So there's nothing, all that the book does really is just kind of bring all that stuff together that's in the New Testament and say, look how this is very common in the New Testament, throughout the New Testament.
Well, I guess it's so. I agree. Yet it's so hard to actually do. I mean, two examples that I can think of. I shared them with you thinking an email. But one, I remember when you got the job in the position at Perkins as dean, and I remember saying, "Well, okay, Craig, that's great. I'm happy for you and all, but how can I capitalize on your success?" And then also, quite frankly, when I started putting together these Zoom calls to talk to people and realized, I do know some pretty interesting folks to talk to. I thought, am I putting these together so that other people, kind of a new version of name dropping, am I putting these together so that other people know that I know some pretty cool people, or am I doing it so that others can see it and also glean from some of the people that I consider pretty interesting and knowledgeable? And it's probably both, but still there's that.
Well, at least you're kind of in the middle place there, where at least you're aware of it. I mean, you're critiquing yourself and you're aware of it. The worst place to be in is just to be doing it and absolutely be doing it for the wrong motives and not care. Or the ideal place to be in is just to be doing things and not even thinking about yourself and its effect on yourself and so forth. And that's the purest place to be in. But most of us aren't there a lot of the time. Well, I suppose, if there's anything, I guess I could talk a little bit about sort of what the book attempts to do. The thing that's most novel about it is actually, I think this says it, the second major chapter of the book. It's been long enough now, I don't remember. The second major chapter of the book is actually on the biology of status, right? And to try to demystify it, Why in the world do we care so much? And we do. We care deeply about what other people think of us. And there's a simple reason. It's our biology. We are the most social of all social animals. We have the ultimate social adaptation, which is language. I don't remember what the number is off the top of my head. I'll get this wrong, and I could correct myself if I went back and looked. But we have something like 47 facial muscles. I don't remember what the exact number is, but that's more than any other animal. A significant part of our brains is just devoted to reading other faces. Mm-hmm. So how do I fit into the herd? What's my place? What's my role? What's my status? That's just a deep part of who we are. A very significant part of our brains actually is always subconsciously working on that question. Mm-hmm. And it affects our health. It affects, we all know the feeling of what it's like to walk into a room full of strangers. And very quickly we're assessing, whether we're realizing or not, we're assessing, well, how do I fit in here? There are studies that have shown that, your cortisol level, stress level increases, just being in the presence of someone with higher status, particularly a boss or someone like.
You mentioned in the book, I went back and kind of perused the book a little bit, and I remember a story that you wrote about of a, hopefully you'll remember it, of a pastor that went and spoke at a particularly conservative.
Oh yeah.
With him. It's kind of.
I think I know the story. Well, it was somebody I worked with years ago, and it was a different denomination. They went to different denominations. His wife was with him, and it turned. She didn't realize that among the things this congregation did differently culturally was, they followed the scriptural injunction about not decorating yourselves or whatever. And so she came in with jewelry on and kind of realized in the middle of the service that none of the women in the congregation wore jewelry. And somehow this very intuitive elderly lady next to her somehow picked up on her discomfort and reached over and patted her and said, "That's okay, dear. We drive big cars." It's just, they have a different status, markers within the group.
The status seeking is there. Just
yeah. It's part of what I wanted to get across is it's endemic to what we are as humans, and there are mistakes. It's like a ditch on either side of a road, right? One side is repression. I'm going to just repress this, and or even pretend it doesn't exist. Push it down, and that just ends up being like whack-a-mole, where you keep hitting it. The problem with it is you're not really acknowledging what's going on. And often it can just show up in some other guise in much worse form, rather than facing honestly with these natural impulses. I mean, this is just like, I related in the book, it's like a sexual desire. It's like the desire for food. I mean, the same, we are pre-wired to desire high density calories. Why? Because they're hard to get in nature, right? Berries only come out every so often. You don't get easily get access to a lot of fat and like that. So we are wired, our pleasure sensors in our brain centers light up with that. Exact same thing happens with status. We have a physiological response to it. And negatively, we have a very strong negative response to it. That's why you get this feeling in the pit of your stomach when something's happened that's lowered your status. So you have repression on one side and indulgence on the other. Well, it's only natural. I'm just going to indulge it. Well, look at where that leads with any natural impulse. It's ultimately destructive. If you just indulge it without limits, you'll hurt yourself. You'll certainly hurt other people. And so we're used to thinking about natural impulses as Christians in a certain way, that they're sort of, we put boundaries around them where it's like a locomotive that we put tracks down and say, there's a Christian way of being human that deals with these impulses in a certain way. So part of the book is just to get people to kind of think about it that way. It's not evil in and of itself. Certainly the desire for significance I mean, there's sort of different levels of this, but at one level, religion is trying to answer the question of human significance. Is there not just meaning in my own life, but meaning in the universe? Is anything important or lasting? And so it's interesting that when this then gets into the Gospels, and the whole rest of the book is about the New Testament. But Jesus, when the disciples ask him about who's the greatest and all that stuff, Jesus never says, "You idiots, don't you know you're insignificant? Your lives have no value or meaning." He never says that. He said, "Well, if you would be great, here's what you do, or here's the kind of person you are." He flips all that upside down. The greatest is the one who serves. Now, nobody in the ancient world wanted to be a servant. You didn't raise your kid to be a servant. A servant was a nobody. I mean, only just above a slave, the bottom layer socially. So the notion, I think, really goes back to Jesus, that you can be great through service. That's really where you find significance. And so Jesus turns that whole thing upside down. And then what's so interesting, if you read the New Testament with an eye open to this, is that you see this again and again and again throughout the New Testament. The New Testament communities, and especially in Paul's letters, because that's where you have the most evidence about the New Testament communities, what they wanted to do, the Corinthians were the champions of this. What they wanted to do was to use Christianity as a new means to an old set of ends, which was self-advancement, security, prosperity, and stuff. But in the case of the Corinthians, particularly self-advancement, and so they used spiritual gifts as status markers. I speak in tongues, I prophesy. They used the one that we might be more tempted on, which is associations. I am of Paul, I'm of Peter, I'm of Apollos, that sort of thing. So they were trying to use Christianity as a means to be somebody in very worldly terms in this world. And so what Paul does brilliantly, and Paul gets this at a level that very few people ever have, is he preaches the cross to them again and again, And I said, "I determine there nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." Because what Paul sees in the cross is God, the pivot in which God flips this reality. The person Paul originally rejected, who couldn't be the Messiah because he was not the victor, because he seemed foolish and weak and suffered. That's the very one God has used to save the world. And so that's the center of God's activity in the world. And Paul gets that, and he can see that about himself now. That where I am weak, then I'm strong. My ministry might appear weak and foolish and so forth. Well, that's because I'm trying to model Christ in what I do. But it's incredibly hard. It's an incredibly hard sell in the ancient world, because they, like us, wanted to use religion as a means of self-importance and security and all those things in this world. So it's fascinating when you look across the New Testament. You see this again and again and again and again. James and many other epistles in the New Testament. They're trying to create Christian community that models this notion that service actually is the highest priority, and where you love not just people in your family, but you love others, even those below you socially. You love them and you serve them. So this is a really radical call. So it's something that most of the New Testament authors had to return to again and again and again. And I'll say one other thing about that. A lot of the Christological passages in the New Testament, which is to say passages that deal with the identity of Jesus and who was he, and so a lot of those actually come up as a consequence of this. So, one of the greatest of these, of course, is the fabulous Christ hymn in Philippians. Who, though he was in the form of God, counted equality with God not something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Well, why does that show up? Is Paul wanting to give a lesson in Christology? No. If you look right before that, they're envying each other. They're squabbling with each other, and Paul says, "No, have this mind which is yours in Christ Jesus." One of the great affirmations about Jesus throughout the Gospel of Mark, for instance, is the servant. and the Son, the Son of Man or humanity, who's the servant. Well, where does that come up in Mark again and again? When the disciples are squabbling over position. So anyway, I think it's a fascinating phenomenon and something often overlooked across the New Testament.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting. And I don't know. You can share this with me if you want, but I think it's interesting with your book, Servant of All. Like I said, I went back to kind of look through it this morning when I was having my coffee, and I have an early emailed copy, and as I was scrolling through it, I realized that wasn't the title of the book, I guess, before it was published.
No.
It was
something else.
Gosh, what was it? The greatest among you, or something like that.
That's also from Mark. Yeah.
And so I noted. I thought that was interesting. Just the perspective. What it's I guess two sides of the same coin. Jockeying for that position, greatest among you, but then the realization and what became actually the title of the book was what actually is the culmination of being great, which is being servant of all.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I thought that was interesting. I didn't know if there was a story behind it, or if
the story,
you were making that decision.
The story behind it was the first title was a lousy title. So,
but I think I might identify with wanting to be great rather than servant. That makes me sound.
How to title a book is often a surprisingly difficult thing. Well, the subtitle is Status, Ambition, and the Way of Jesus, and it's an okay subtitle, but the fact is that the book really focuses on status, and then there's an entire chapter on ambition late in the book. But ambition is so ambiguous. It's a word that covers a waterfront. It's part of what I wanted to show in the book, because it's about motivation. Talking about someone's ambitious to do something. Well, you mean they're highly motivated to do something. What? To what degree? What are they motivated to do? Why are they motivated to do it? And so on. And so you have to really start taking that apart. It's hard to say ambition. Saying ambition itself is wrong. It's like, motivation's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, surely not. I mean, nobody would ever go into ministry and do anything important without being strongly motivated. You have to be. But is it motivation because of narcissism? Because of a weakness? One of the things I think that actually the piece of the book that goes back the furthest, goes back a long time, is the exegesis of the foot washing story, which is the picture of the cover. I don't have a copy of the book to hold up.
Oh, I don't have it.
There's one here somewhere.
I'll edit one into our conversation.
Well, anyway, but that struck me a long time ago. That story is such an important story, and in John 13, it's lifted up really as an important story. Jesus even says, "I've given you this example," because in the story, it says Jesus, knowing he'd come from the Father, knowing he was going to the Father, and so forth, takes a towel. He's the only one in the room who knows who he is, and therefore the only one free to serve. And so this is a case of someone serving out of strength. He is able to take on the role of a servant, which it absolutely was. I mean, foot washing is the lowest job of the house. If you do it, you're giving a physical demonstration that you're nobody, or you're at the bottom of the pecking order. And so, of course, the disciples aren't going to do it. They're squabbling their position all through the narrative. So Jesus does that, but he does it because he's strong. He does it because he knows in God who he is already. The disciples are in a position of weakness, and therefore they're not free to serve. Mm-hmm. And that story is such a powerful paradigm to me, that there's a kind of service you can do out of weakness where it is about getting attention. you know.
Mhm.
And so where do you get that strength of identity from that sets you free to serve without having to be noticed, you know, without having to, where you could in fact be looked down upon as Jesus would be as a servant in that case. And so I think the danger, there are a lot of subtle dangers in ministry. I mean, our life is full of subtle spiritual, moral dangers, but ministry is, you know, you almost everybody, and I'm sure, well, I'm in this number, and you probably are. How did you get into ministry in the first place? Well, you had you know, certain gifts and graces, and people patted you on the back, you know, when you were younger, and maybe you helped lead a youth service at church, or you know, whatever, and or you helped out at camp or something, and people patted you on the back and said, "Wow, you know, you should really think about going to ministry or whatever." And that's good. I mean, we should be recognizing people's gifts and encouraging them. But there's a subtle danger in that, because if that's what you end up living for, ministry is almost certainly going to disappoint you, because at some point you're not going to receive all that adulation, all those accolades. And if you do, I mean, you're tempted either way, because if you do, the temptation is to be egocentric and to just be working for that, to never get beyond that. Or if you don't get it and you're still in that place, to be frustrated and disappointed. And you know, most people I know in ministry who are, you know, say 50 years old, and dejected and disillusioned and so forth, it's because at some point they went from having a vocational mindset to having a careerist mindset, where you know, originally they could pray that incredibly challenging Wesley Covenant prayer, you know, but over time, and again, I completely understand this. I'm not trying to belittle anyone. It's I know I understand this because I understand it, you know, myself. But over time, they go to annual conference, they see who gets attention, they see who gets praise, and they start molding themselves in that way. And you know, they see what the top job in the, you know, what's the best church in the conference, or a couple of, you know, tall steeple churches. And so they bend their career, you know, to be on the trajectory, to be on the ladder, to get to that position. Well, a lot of those jobs, you know, there might be 4, 5, 6 dozen people who want them, who think they've earned them. Well, they open up every 10 or 20 years. And it's a sure thing. And all the more so now, that most people who think they deserve them, and maybe do deserve them, won't get them. And we have this narrative in our heads that, well, you get what you deserve, and you go, well, actually, no. In a lot of cases, that's not true. So people who thrive in ministry, by and large, are going to be people who are doing it for the right reasons, because you know, you have to be willing to be obscure. You have to be willing to, you know, say, well, I'm going to, you know, what matters is what matters in God. What matters ultimately, it's how am I serving where I am, because that's, you know, that's been true. I made this point in the book that that's true for the majority of humanity throughout all human history. I mean, you know, if you were a serf in Russia or a slave in America or whatever, I don't care what your gifts were, your talents, your ability, in all likelihood, you were never going to be in a position to exercise them fully. And you know, that's the ideal, and I'd love it if everyone could do that. So you have a choice of serving where you are, doing the best you can, and finding your satisfaction, your meaning in God, as the one who, as I said, signs your report card, tells you who you are, or looking to everyone else to do that. And if you're in the latter position, it's an inherently weak position to be in. Now, but again, I know we're all tempted to be there. That's the way we're wired. And so we have to find a depth spiritually where God really is our most significant other.
I think that's I don't know that that's a difficult thing. I think I get that, and I love that. I remember I'm a second career guy. I went into pastoral ministry after having another career, and I remember when my wife and I were talking about it and going into it, and we'd made that. Gone through the discernment for really a couple of years, going back and forth, and decided to make that leap. And I remember driving down the road. She and I were driving down the road. Cindy said to me, she said, "Okay, so what's your goal? What are your goals in ministry?" And because I had always been very goal oriented, and I sat there and I thought about it, and I thought, for the first time, I don't really have any goals. Maybe I serve 50-person churches the rest of my life, or maybe, I don't know. Whatever it is, I'm open to it. Having said that, it wasn't too many years later that, like you said, you're at annual conference and you're going, okay, this was, and I don't know so much. I know early on in our discussion, I kind of painted myself as this, looking for the status and ambition. But I do think recognizing and realizing that along the way, I wanted to be and want to be everything that God is calling me to be. And I don't want, somebody also mentioned to me early on in my ministry, don't sell God short in your ministry. And so I like the idea of who signs your report card that you brought up. And so if I'm looking at, if God is looking at my report card, how am I doing? And who is it I'm trying to?
Well, God's a gracious grader too.
Thank goodness.
You have somebody who loves you who's signing your report card. Yeah. Well, actually, I wrote the other day, we're doing this in the midst of the COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And I sent a letter to students, Perkins School of Theology students, a couple of days ago about the whole issue of vocation in a time of uncertainty, which this certainly is, and told them that, I remember I was interviewing on a committee, interviewing candidates for scholarships a while back, and there was a concern that one of the candidates did not have enough vocational clarity. And I think I surprised the other people on the committee. I said, vocational clarity is highly overrated. I mean, I when I was in seminary long ago, I probably had a lot of vocational clarity, almost none of which ever happened. I mean, my life has taken a completely different turn. I've had almost nothing in the last 30 years what I've ever predicted has happened. The times, I mean, I'm not trying to, again, argue against somebody trying to do something. I'm not arguing for passivity, but that's just not the way my life hasn't worked. When I've tried to go somewhere, it's almost inevitably been blocked, and I've ended up being led in a very different direction. What I think we need in ministry and in candidates for ministry is not so much clarity as flexibility. They need to be clear about the commitment to serve.
Mm-hmm.
That's rock solid. That's the core of the calling, of the vocation. But they need to be flexible about what form that might take. I always imagine the town I lived in for a long time in Illinois had a lake nearby, and I always kind of think about people who are on one side of the lake and they look way across on the other side of the lake, and they're in a power boat and they're just going to go zipping across the lake and get right there. I haven't been in a power boat in my life. I've been a sailboat. So I've been tacking,
right,
one side to the other, to the other, to the other, and get there eventually, but never on the route I would have imagined. And so I think particularly now when, what I grew up with is a very stable church environment and culture is just not there anymore. It's not stable. And we really need people going into ministry who are much more flexible and creative and entrepreneurial, much more mission oriented than, because before it was, you could have a kind of cookie cutter preparation for ministry and you go into a kind of cookie cutter job in a church, that's just not going to fly much.
Right.
And in a way, it forces us back to our roots, to mission. I take some joy in the fact that both the Apostle Paul and John Wesley, neither one of them really came into their call until they left what they thought their call was. Right.
Right.
They went way outside of their comfort zone, kind of the opposite of their comfort zone. And that's where they actually found their real mission in ministry.
Yeah. And hopefully, I think that's a very, very wise word. But I am too cheap to pay for the additional minutes on Zoom calls. I think we're getting close.
Oh, okay. Are we?
Well, my Zoom thing, it's flown by. I've really enjoyed our visit.
Professional hazard, just talking too much. Yeah.
And you've probably gotten at least 200 emails that you've got to respond to while we've been sitting here talking. But no, I've enjoyed the visit. Enjoyed catching up. Enjoyed the discussion. I think you bring up a lot of great points here.
Well, I hope you'll be a kind editor.
Editing. I don't know what you're talking about with editing.
We can make this about 6 minutes.
Yeah, I only edit myself and this stuff.
And make yourself look good at my expense. Okay.
That's right. No, I truly have enjoyed this, and I know we're hopefully we'll be able to get back to normal and get to see you in person here sometime in the not too
yeah, I hope so too. It'd be good to see you again. Thanks.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks,
of course.
And God bless you and your family.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
All right.